as parents, have you ever stopped and looked at your children, maybe in person, or you looked at your children in a photo, and you looked at them and said, why them? That's supposed to be funny. No, but seriously, you ask, why them? You know, why their eye color or why their hair color? You know, why especially if one doesn't necessarily look like you, looks like, you know, the other spouse, you know, me would be my wife or you ladies, your husband, you know, why? Why, Lord, why? You know? So you may, and I know you could get into that in a negative sense when it comes to their behavior, you know, and, you know, whenever you got little kids running around and you compliment them and you'll say something like, oh, looks just like his mama, or she looks like her mama, or whatever, and then you'll get one parent says, acts just like them too, you know. And so you get that humorous response. But nonetheless, you notice things about kids, and sometimes you have questions. Well, that's pretty much being one-sided. Have you ever stopped and think that a kid, any and every kid may ask, why this lady for my mom and why this lady for my dad? Now, I don't have to ask that question in a negative sense because all of y'all in this room know my parents. So I am so blessed and I am so thankful for having parents that raised me in this church, in this very church since I was 2 weeks old. Mama testifies that when I was 2 weeks old, I was in that nursery. And a couple of you in here could probably verify that. Okay, I don't know if y'all remember back then or what time, how early y'all started coming here. But my mom says in the old building, yeah, I was in nursery 2 weeks after I was born. And I was raised in this church till I was 14 years. So I'm very grateful for, you know, parents that raised me in church. So I have nothing negative to say about my parents. But that's not always the case with some kids. And sadly, especially if you got a single parent home, and they look at other family units that are functional and wholesome, and theirs is dysfunctional, and they want to know why. Why did I have to have a dad that abandoned us? Why did I have to have a mom that's hooked on this or hooked on that? Okay, well, it gets you to thinking, because we as parents want to look at it from our point of view. But if we ever stop and think, what do our kids think of us? It might make, and if we had this message to young parents, it might make a difference in their life. As your kids grow up, what do they think of you? So as we begin this journey tonight for the next few weeks, we want to discuss tonight Jesus's heroic parents. Why out of every single woman on the face of the earth 2,000 years ago, why did he choose Mary? Out of every man that could have been selected, obviously he's got to do a stepdad role. So I understand what that's like myself. So I can relate to Joseph in that capacity. So obviously he raises Jesus, and you see in Matthew 13:55 how many brothers, and he has at least 2 sisters. So you knew he grew up with those who bore the resemblance. One may look like Joseph, one may have looked like Mary, and he may have been treated by them as the redheaded stepchild, so to speak. Okay? But why Joseph? Of all the men who could have been the stepfather for our Lord and Savior, what was so special about Joseph? Well, obviously, one of his qualifications is found in Luke 2:4, is because he's of the house and lineage of David. Okay, that's obvious. But what we want to address from the get-go, from the first lesson having to do with why Joseph, to the last lesson having to do with the wise men and their gifts. We wanted to dispel the whole notion of Jesus being a poor, lowly carpenter son. We want to dispel the notion that Joseph himself was some poor, minimum wage, woodworking carpenter. We need to dispel that right off the bat. Because one thing that makes perfect common sense, have you ever seen footage of Israel, Jerusalem? You don't see any trees. So what makes you think everything was made of wood? Some things were made of wood, but most of it was made out of stone. Brick. Even the Egyptians, had the children of Israel making brick. It didn't say they had them sawing logs, had them making brick. Okay? So we got to get that out of our mind here. Because in Matthew 13:55 is one of the places where we see it says, "Is not this the carpenter's son?" That word carpenter is arguably one of the most mistranslated words in the entire New Testament. Because being translated carpenter, especially in our culture, we automatically think wood. Hammer and nails, saws cutting trees down, as our logger brother in that line of work he's involved with. We automatically think woodwork. Well, that word carpenter is the word tekton, Tekton. And it's where we get our word technology from. Now, I know my brother who's into this line of work, but this day and time, but I'm talking about way back then. What was so technological about wood? You cut a tree down, you saw it up, you put it in 2x4s, 2x6s, whatever, plywood, and you build stuff with it. What's so technologically advanced about wood? Okay, so a tekton was one who was highly advanced in general in whatever skill he possessed. It wasn't the minimum wage, lowest guy on the totem pole worker. A carpenter was just the opposite. A carpenter was the man in charge. Okay? Technically advanced skills is what it involved. This always referred to exquisite furniture, but beyond that, it included jewelry, mosaics, and particularly stonework. The very word comes from a verb that means to bring forth. One who has the expertise to vision and to create with his hands a well-wrought final product. It was so associated with the idea of creativity that even some of the ancient writers would use this same word to describe literary giants. People that we know, authors like Shakespeare and others that we would think of in our history books. They would be called a tekton because they were advanced in their skill in whatever field they were in. It depicted one who could create wonders out of materials and develop products that were beyond ordinary skills. Everything wasn't always, traditionally built. It was something new and innovative. Tekton was a highly compensated position because it referred to masterful artisans that made such things, and I'm going to give you a list. Intricately designed buildings. In other words, the architecture was state of the art. It was something that was different than your traditional rectangular building, 4 square corners, put a roof on it and call it a day. It was something that was elaborate. It was floors covered with mosaics. You had to have the one in charge to know how to put the mosaics together. That was the job of a tekton. It was elaborate frescoes. Now, this was paintings that were done in watercolor on wet plaster, so that on walls and ceilings, so that the colors would soak in and penetrate, and when it dries, to give it a beautiful color. Everything wasn't just white. Everything wasn't just gray. Also, it had to do with sculptures carved of marble. You would have tectons that what they did, they just carved the sculptures. In addition to that, it was pieces of jewelry fabricated from gold or silver and adorned with precious jewels. So if you had a jeweler, I know in my lifetime, I don't see that many anymore, but we used to have a jewelry store in Hampton and a sister location in Beaufort, and I knew the owners of that. I used to sell them advertising and everything, the Conard family. And you could call them, I don't know if y'all knew them very well or not, but Mr. Junior especially, I love going in there talking to Mr. Junior. I'd go in and talk to him for an hour. You know, it'd take me 5 minutes to sell him an ad, but, you know, I'd talk to him for an hour. And I can tell he was so skilled in his craft. It was so, he had that, you know, put those glasses on and can do that tedious work. That tedious work required skill. That was the job of a tecton. Also, use of ivory. Ivory, of course, come from tusk and that kind of thing, especially when it came to jewelry and furniture. It was fabulously designed furniture embellished with ornate elements made of bronze, silver, gold, and precious jewels. So you would have fixtures that would involve more than one metal. How do you blend them together? How do you bend it? How do you shape it? How do you get all that to do? That was the job of a tecton. If you will, it's like the architect or a civil engineer today. That's a tecton. One scholar noted that he was so highly skilled he could create shiny and splendid things to appear so extraordinarily beautiful that it just make them, as they would say and we would say, they just came to life. They would take the ordinary and make it come to life. So in short, it was a highly advanced, skilled, versatile craftsman who knew every aspect of the building. If I got to work with mosaics, I can tell the one who's working on the mosaics how to do what I need him to do. If it's stonework, I know how to do the stonework. Now, for that that tells you right there that Joseph wasn't no 15-year-old kid either. He had some years under his belt. He was significantly older than Mary, we know. Okay? So he was one who had worked his way up the ladder. He was not the lowest man on the totem pole. He was not the gopher. He was the one telling others to gopher. Okay? And they had these technical skills that they can do things so advanced that it would be something nobody had ever seen before. And as you know, what that does is it creates a reputation. Well, what about this reputation? Well, it says in Matthew 13:55 that it says, we read it casually as, is this not the carpenter's son? May I suggest to you, you read it this way. Is this not the carpenter's son? Of all the carpenters, of all the tectons there may have been, Joseph was the one. If you study the way it is and you see the emphasis placed on it, that was him. Well, fast forwarding a little bit in Mark chapter 6 and verse 3, it says Jesus learned, obviously he learned the trade of Joseph. Typically a boy started at the age of 12 after his bar mitzvah, so to speak. He would begin working in the shop with daddy. At the age 17, he was old enough to be no longer called a child, a teknon. This is tekton, is carpenter, but teknon is a child, but a son is weos. So at the age 17, he's able to take over the family business if need be. He's highly skilled because he's already got 5 years of working with daddy, whether it was farming or whether it was carpentry, so to speak. So that at age 17, he knew the business and his daddy could trust him and leave him with it and do whatever he needed to go do, you know, go off on a business trip or whatever to go get materials and leave the son with him. So you got to understand, Jesus was highly involved in Joseph's line of work. Because in Mark 6:3, it says, of Jesus, is this not the carpenter? It doesn't say the carpenter's son, because it goes on in this case to say the son of Mary. That's another story, because that's a slap in the face that somebody's trying to make a snotty remark, trying to say that he's an illegitimate child. Because normally everybody's recognized by who your daddy is because of that fatherly lineage. For them to out of the clear blue mention Mary, that was an insult. That was a slap in the face. But what we draw from that is the fact that it says, is this not the carpenter? So after Joseph passed away, it's a very logical conclusion to draw, and that is Jesus took over Joseph's business, and he was known as the Tecton. His daddy was the best one around here, and he learned from the best, and he took over the family business. However long that was, we don't know. We don't know what age Joseph died. We know the life expectancy was between 50 and 65 years of age. So we know that he was dead before Jesus started his ministry at age 30. So he could have passed away when Jesus was 20, 21, 22, 25, 27. We just don't know for sure. But we do know that both Joseph and Jesus were masterful tectons. They were artisans who had the ability to envision what others couldn't see. And it's funny that the Lord times these things is because Anna came in from work today, and I asked her, I said, you got supper? And normally she'll say, well, I'm just going to get me a salad. And she, opens up the refrigerator and she goes, and when she gives me that little, I'm not really feeling this. I said, you want to get a sub? Let's go get a sub. So we had coupons, so we went to Subway, and each of us got a sub, and we came back and we were eating it. So I'm going to put something on television, for her that she would enjoy while we're eating our sub. Well, we're watching Fixer Upper. Y'all have seen Fixer Upper, right? With Joanna Gaines. Okay? Well, it's amazing how you can take a dilapidated building and walk in there, and she's got an eye to see its potential. And of course, on the show, it says, it shows all the schematics and everything. And of course, you always know a wall's getting knocked out. That's number one. Number two, every kitchen's going to have an island. Okay, those are just some things that on that show, at least one wall's getting knocked out. Okay, because she's got to have, her husband something to do on demolition day. Okay, but you see the point there. This is what Joseph had this ability, and yet Jesus did as well, apparently, for him to be referred to as the carpenter. They could create wonders out of these materials. They could just elaborately put it together because they can envision it. So Jesus was anointed to do what Joseph was anointed to do. Okay? So that presents a problem for the religious people. That's why Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:16 says this. He's saying it to us, and then he mentions Jesus as an example. He says, therefore, from now on, we recognize no one according to the flesh. Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him in this way no longer. Now he's saying it in the sense of, we all knew Jesus. To see Paul now, this is Paul talking. So Paul wasn't a disciple like James and John and Matthew and all the others. Okay? Paul was still around at the time, persecuting the church, so he had heard about Jesus growing up. So everybody knew him according to the flesh as a carpenter. He says now we don't even consider that. That's way back when. Now we see him as the Christ. Okay, well, Paul didn't have a problem with that, but the religious leaders did. Because if you will, let's say he was working, that's just for the sake of a hypothetical example. Let's say he was working with Joseph as a mature son at age 17. He had been helping him out, running errands for him from 12 to 17. And let's just say at age 17, he is his right-hand man and then takes over as the carpenter whenever Joseph passes away. So it's conceivable that there's at least from 17 to 30, a 13-year span where Jesus is recognized according to the flesh as a tecton. Now, he starts ministry as a rabbi, as a healer, undeniable miracle worker. Can you imagine how hard it was for some of them to swallow? Now he's preaching a message and he's telling them, I am Israel's hope. I'm the Messiah. He said it in Luke 4. Today, the scripture has been fulfilled in your midst. The religious leaders had such a problem with that because they're sitting there thinking, our Messiah is going to be of royalty. There is no way a man of trade could be the Messiah. That's what presented an issue for him. It was this whole concept of a tekton. Jesus is still the carpenter today. Because in Ephesians 2:10 it says, we are his workmanship. That word workmanship is poiema. It comes from the word poieo. And it has to do with what you do, but you do it with creativity. So we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. So he's still being a tekton in that capacity, because we are his workmanship. Okay? He's taking, just like he did in the natural, and he took raw materials and made something elaborate and beautiful because he saw what the building could be. Just like we talked about on the show, Joanna Gaines can see what this dump can be if we go through all these renovations. Likewise, spiritually, he saw what Peter was going to be post-Pentecost. That's why he was so patient with him. He saw what all the disciples could be. Although he got frustrated, that's why he was patient with them. A tekton could also depict a master stonemason or a masterful stone carver or an architect committed to architectural design for monumental building projects, temples, palaces fashioned of stone. Chances are, if the king wanted to construct a new palace or add on to the palace or build a new temple, they want to know who is the carpenter in town. At the time, it would have been Joseph. For a period of time, it was likely Jesus. It also depicted a chief overseer that directed other buildings, other builders, and other artisans over massive building projects. Because you got to understand, Herod needed tektons at this time to construct Sepphoris. Nazareth was a little village, which we'll get to in just a moment, about 4 miles away from this center, this city that was under construction at the time. History tells us that. And so the name of it was Sepphoris. So he needed specialists that could design buildings, temples, villas, palaces. He needed them to work with marble. He needed them to build columns, to do floors. He needed mosaics involved. He needed walls that were frescoes. He needed things fashioned with bronze, some things fashioned with silver, some things fashioned with gold, some things with ivory. All that you see on TV or when it depicts those beautiful king's palaces. It took someone of this nature to design all that. So he was a building supervisor with quite a reputation, if you will. So that's what would catch man's eye. Seeing him and his reputation that he had established through the years as a tekton, that no doubt caught man's eye. Just like around here, if there's a major construction project fixing to take place in the industrial park, they're probably asking around, we want to employ the home folks. Who is the premier architect or engineer in Hampton? Well, a few names, maybe even one, could probably be mentioned as the one that you want to get to do the project. Chances are that was Joseph. Chances are it was Jesus. So what, spiritually speaking, caught God's eye? Because it's said of Mary, she found favor with God. But it's obvious Joseph found favor as well. May I suggest to you is found in Luke 16. Luke 16 and verses 10 through 13. Jesus himself taught this. So I would suggest to you that he's teaching from his own experience as well. He's teaching from his own family experience as well. He's teaching what he knows. based from experience and maybe even from what he saw in his daddy, Joseph. It says, he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is also unjust in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, referring to currency, who will commit to your trust the true riches? Jesus being born and being given the responsibility to Joseph and Mary, that's the truest riches I can imagine ever in human history. The greatest honor to Joseph and Mary is the true riches of raising Jesus. What an honor and a privilege that was. What qualified him? The man in that male-dominated society, he had to catch the community's eye. He had to catch Mary's parents' eye in order for them to approve based on how marriages were arranged, which we've got time, we'll get to it tonight. Okay? But what caught God's eye? I will suggest to you is this. And if you have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he'll hate one and love the other, or he'll hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Joseph, no doubt, as a tecton, not being the low man on the totem pole, but being the supervisor, if you will, he no doubt had a good paycheck, but he stewarded it well. Even before Jesus came along, even before Mary caught his eye, he stewarded it well. It's obvious. So therefore, I would suggest to you that what qualified him in God's eyes, which is what qualifies us today in his eyes, is how well we steward that which is unrighteous mammon. He's watching these offering plates. Just as he watched in the widow's mite, the story of the widow's mite, he watched how people gave. That was a concern for his. Why? Because he needed the money? No. No, he didn't need the money, and we'll show you why he didn't need the money. But it was something that he emphasized because how well we steward unrighteous mammon qualifies us for true riches. If you can't handle money, how's he going to trust you with the gospel? If you can't handle money, how's he going to trust those of us to be a pastor? Okay? How's he going to do it? So he had to have shown him that he can handle well and steward well the true riches. Now, spiritually speaking, there was another aspect of stewardship that was rare. In Matthew chapter 1, verses 19 through 25. It says, Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privately. But while he thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take Mary unto thee thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and thou call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Now all of this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Isaiah, that is, Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. We'll teach on that in great detail next week or the week after. Then Joseph, being raised from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife. Okay, let me stop there and we'll finish that last statement in just a moment. Joseph had to be a man who was spiritually in tune to the voice of the Lord, because none of this seemed to have caught him by surprise. It doesn't say, like we were discussing in prayer meeting a while ago, that disciples, when Jesus appeared to them on resurrection night, he scared the fool out of them, and he had to speak peace to them to calm their fears. How many times when an angel appears or the Lord speaking to somebody, he's having to say, fear not. You don't see any of that right here. There's no indication that Joseph awoke from sleep, sweating in his sleep. The way it's handled here It's like he was accustomed to God speaking to him in a dream. He was accustomed to the voice of the Lord. He had been raised that way, to be in tune to the voice of the Lord. So therefore, whenever he tells him what he should do, he doesn't question it. You don't see any but Lord. No, there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He immediately gets up and does what God tells him. That doesn't happen overnight. It had to be that he had established a spiritual connection with God through previous dreams. Maybe God spoke to him how to design a building. I know he speaks to me concerning how to construct a sermon. I'll get a scripture, I'll get an outline, I'll get a title. Sometimes in the middle of the night I'll wake up and there it is. Could it be that he was accustomed to the Lord giving him a plan of action of how to do something as a tekton? And now, spiritually speaking, he stewarded well those dreams and instructions before. Now God knew that I don't need to have a burning bush. I don't even need to send an angel of the Lord to scare him, to poof out of the clear blue. It just simply says he could appear to him in a dream, just as he did Solomon. God appeared to Solomon in a dream, did it not? Why? Solomon had been trained by David to listen for the voice of the Lord. So Solomon wasn't spooked when God appeared to him in a dream. Neither is Joseph. And he immediately, without question, without ifs, ands, or buts, he immediately complies. Furthermore, he is such a righteous man. It says, he took unto him his wife and knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. Why? Because it was instructed to him in the dream that she's a virgin, which was important to him. Because remember it says he was going to put her away because seemingly she had stepped out on him. But the Lord confirmed to him she's a virgin because it was supposed to be a virgin birth. Therefore, Joseph knew not one single sperm of mine needs to be in her body. He is a hormone-driven male, just like any of us males were at that age. And yet he had the wherewithal to hug her, to marry her, to kiss her, to take good care of her, and never have intercourse with her. That is a man of God. That is a man of God that would do that. So that right there speaks volumes of how he could be trusted in that manner. So he was so spiritually in tune. Also, you see it further in Matthew chapter 2, in verses 13 to 14 for the sake of time, that he heeds instruction in a dream again about it's time to take them into Egypt. Now that right there took a lot of faith as well. Because see, for Joseph being a tekton, what you don't understand is in the culture of that day, they had trade guilds. Trade guilds, G-U-I-L-D-S, back in the culture of that day. And if you weren't a member of a trade guild, you're not getting the bid on any job. You got to have work permits to be able to be licensed, just like a building. You got to have permits. You got to have permits to be able to do the work. Not just have the work be constructed on a piece of land, but you had to have work permits. So Joseph is accustomed to all this. Well, for him to uproot and go into a plight into Egypt, where he did not have a membership in any trade guild there, he did not have a work permit to find a job there, even though he was so highly skilled, he probably knew more than others that were busy working in those various stops because they were constantly on the go. We'll get to that later. They were constantly on the move, running from Herod. But that right there took faith. What calmed it was a dream. When God spoke to him, he heeded it. You also see in Luke 2, it says, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. There wasn't a matter of, Mary, you go, I'm working. Every year as the head of the house, he made sure his family attended the Passover in Jerusalem, which is a good little ride. Then on top of that, it says repeatedly, even in Luke chapter 4, that he went into the synagogue as was his custom. He was raised in church like I was raised in church. I mean, I was raised in church, in this church, so I can identify with this. Okay? He observed the Passover faithfully. So that made him a candidate. Now, because he was such a well-respected man in the community, because he no doubt was considered a spiritual man, those two, among other factors, well-mannered, perhaps handsome, good-looking, strong, a good provider, a good steward of his resources. The boy managed his time well. The boy got up early. He was very good at reporting to work. He didn't lay out of work. There were probably so many character traits about Joseph that caught Joachim and Anna's eye, Mary's parents. They probably had their eye on him, and they're probably sitting there thinking, if there's one man in this whole city I want for my precious little Mary, it's that man. And they may have been eyeing him for years. Mary is the daughter, as we said, of Joachim, and some say Anne, some say Anna. So it depends on commentaries, translations, whatever. Okay? But obviously he was from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth means branch. It was so obscure that there was very little known about it. It was an agricultural village, we do know. There was only about 120 to 150 residents in Nazareth. No one dared to go there unless you had business there. Why? Because it was off the beaten path, for one thing, and it was an outpost for troops. So troops would stop there because it's, not very well inhabited. So they stopped there, so you can imagine what all went on there in Nazareth. It had to have a negative reputation because in John 1:46, Nathanael says, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Nazareth did not have a good reputation. And yet that's where Jesus was, his hometown. That's where he came out of. That word for Nestor is a shoot or a branch. You see it in Isaiah 11:1 is the prophecy that's where he would come from. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. A branch, which is Nazareth, means branch. A branch of Jesse's family historically is recorded to have relocated there about 100 BC. So that family had been living there for about 100 years before Jesus was born. So Joseph, his daddy, his granddaddy, and great-granddaddy all were probably from there. It says in Luke 1:32, he shall be given the throne of his father David. Luke 1:69, raise up a horn of salvation to us in the house of his servant David. Romans 1:3, of the seed of David, according to the flesh. So, because it was a virgin birth, that also indicates that Mary had to be of the lineage of David as well. Let me show you. In Matthew 1:1-16, for the sake of time, we don't have time to read the whole genealogy because some of those names are hard to pronounce anyway. But in that genealogy, you have two genealogies in the Gospels. In Matthew's account, you have the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham through Joseph, son of Jacob. But in that genealogy, I want you to note this in verse 12. It mentions Jeconiah. Now, Jeconiah was a wicked king who failed to repent, and he was struck with a curse. And that curse is found in Jeremiah 22:30. That curse says this, "Thus says Yahweh, write ye this man childless," Jeconiah, "a man shall not prosper in his days, for no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah." So, right there smack dab in the middle of that genealogy is Jeconiah. And yet there's a prophecy from Jeremiah that says no one from his lineage on down will sit on the throne, which would seemingly disqualify Jesus, because Joseph is part of that lineage. Joseph's daddy's part of that lineage. So why was Jesus not disqualified? It's obvious. That's what necessitated a virgin birth. Now, Jesus also had a biological right through Mary. In Luke's genealogy, in Luke 3, verses 23 through 38, you see it backwards, backing all the way up to Adam through Seth. Verse 23, "And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. Heli understood to be," now we know Joseph's dad was Jacob. So why does it say Joseph, which was the son of Heli? Seems a little odd, don't it? Because we know Jacob had the 12 sons, and we know that Joseph was next to the baby, Benjamin being born after him. So why does it say here, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli? Okay? Because Heli is understood as another name for Joachim, which was Mary's father. And that is recorded in history in the Proto-Evangelium of James. That's the name of the source. The Proto-Evangelium of James. It records that Heli and Joachim are basically one and the same person. He's not here tonight. He couldn't be here tonight, but it's no different than Angus and Gator. We know to be one and the same person. I was going to use that as an example if he could have been here tonight. If you say Angus Alberson, you know good and well who we're talking about. If you say Gator Alberson, you know exactly who we're talking about. You say, well, are they brothers? No, they're one and the same person. Same way here. Because genealogies are often recorded via the male, it is understood that some occasions the word son can also mean son-in-law. So in this genealogy, it's understood that it means Joseph is the son-in-law of Heli, and Heli, just like Gator and Angus, are one and the same person. Another name is Joachim, and that's how we get her daddy's name as being Joachim. It's recorded elsewhere, but it's in the history books. Now, Nazareth was about 400 feet above a valley, and it was about 4 miles away from Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was going to be the mega city. It was going to be the New York City. It was going to be the Broad Street. It was going to be the Wall Street. It's going to be all of that. It's going to be the banking center of the Middle East. So there were a lot of buildings going up constantly. So therefore you can see Joseph was quite busy, and therefore Jesus had been quite busy. This would provide the illustrations that Jesus would talk about. We talked about money. He understood it. He grew up with it. When he talked about farming, Nazareth was an agricultural society, so he understood about farming. So whether it was the small town or the big city, he had illustrations from both areas to be able to use in his parables, and he did. It is understood that Joachim, through church history, all these early Christian writers, that there was a luxurious synagogue in Sepphoris. And in Sepphoris, it was a huge synagogue, and it was known for its collection of scrolls. And it's understood in church history that Joachim was the scroll keeper, or one of the scroll keepers. He was a keeper of the scrolls. So if he was a keeper of the scrolls, he was a man of the word. Therefore, it's a logical conclusion that Mary grew up knowing the word, because her daddy was a scroll keeper. He oversaw a library, and so therefore her life was built around the word. She knew the word. It is understood that Joachim and Anna were wealthy, yet it records that they gave much of their resources in historical writings. They gave much of their resources to the work of God. They were both up in age when Mary was born. Very similar to Elizabeth and Zacharias. Okay? So Mary can draw some relation there. But it's understood that they prayed for a child and they vowed to give him or her whatever they were given. They were vowed to give them over to the Lord. And that's part of the word prosuke, which is a common use of the word that's translated prayer in the New Testament. And it means to make a vow or a wish. You saw it with Hannah. Lord, I want a child, and if you give me a child, if you give me a son, I will give him to you. It was a deal. It was a vow. It was a promise that if you bless us with a child, we promise to dedicate this child to you. And it is recorded that such vow was made by Joachim and Anna, that we're up in age. If you give us a child, male or female, we will dedicate this child to you. And it happened to be a little girl, and they named her Mary. She was obviously raised in church, obviously raised in a synagogue. Therefore, she could give a mature response to Gabriel when Gabriel appears to her. They relocated to Nazareth, obviously. And so she was, from what church history says, she was enrolled in a special school so that trained young girls how to be a handmaid. Remember, that's what she says. Behold, the handmaiden of the Lord. She was trained to know how to be a handmaiden as part of the family and how to be a handmaiden when it comes to be a servant of the Lord. Jewish girls were traditionally eligible for betrothal at the age of 12. And some even married that early. So it's likely that Mary became pregnant between the ages of 12 and 14. That's pretty young. Joseph was obviously significantly older. He already had a well-established career at this time. Now, a betrothal was a three-step process. There was the announcement, a public announcement, that a selection had been made. And I'm sure Joachim and Anna were grinning from ear to ear. They got their boy. Thank you, Lord. We got our boy. Joseph's a fine, fine, fine man. And we're so happy that he's going to be marrying our little girl, the one that we dedicated to you. What a fine man. What a fine spiritual man. What a fine businessman. And we couldn't ask for a better man. I am so proud. We have 5 kids, obviously. We have 3 sons and 2 daughters. And as a dad, those of you, your boys are one thing. We love them. But there's something about those little girls. Okay? There's something about the way a little girl touches your daddy's heart. I'm sure Christy was that way. I'm sure your daughter was that way. There's just something that's the same way with Aisha and Jordan. The boys always noticed it, and it ain't trying to be favoritism. They just like, you just got to understand. And then when Riley had his little girl, he's like, Daddy, I understand what you're talking about now. He's got Maddox, which is the older boy, and now he's got Landry. And he's like, there's something about those little girls when they come jump in your lap. Okay? So there's something about this little girl. And I'm so proud likewise of our sons-in-law. I wouldn't trade Christian or Caleb in for anybody. I love them. I'm so proud of them. They're good providers for Aisha and Jordan, and I love them. And I'm sure they were very proud of them. The betrothal was a 1 year of purity, training, and preparation. It was a legal engagement that could only be dissolved by a divorce. They equated engagement with marriage. It was basically one and the same. It was a marriage ceremony and a consummation after 1 year. Now, we've got about 8 minutes left, and I can squeeze this in and let you know a typical betrothal back in those days. A ketubah. Okay? It was first initiated by the groom, either the groom himself or the groom along with his father. So the groom-to-be, before there's an engagement, the groom-to-be would go to the bride's house before he even dates the girl. He would go to the bride's house to negotiate a price with her father. You see it in the Old Testament. Jacob had to work 7 years for Leah and another 7 years for Rachel. For David to marry Saul's daughter required 100 Philistine foreskins. Abraham sent 10 camels to go find his son's wife. Now, the gift was one thing, but it was mainly the money. Why? Because every member of the family had a role. So if you're marrying my daughter as a dad, you're marrying my daughter, and you're taking her away from this family, you're taking away her role in this family, and I'm going to have to hire someone to replace her. It's no different than if we had a big ranch and we had a big plantation or whatever you want to call it, and all our family lived at home. All our boys worked on the plantation. Both girls worked on the plantation. And let's just take Jordan, because y'all know Jordan, from Caleb being growing up here. So everybody here knows Jordan. Well, Jordan's a chef. Well, her role would have been cooking and doing the chefing, to doing the baking and all that kind of stuff. So Caleb comes and asks me, he didn't come to me and give me a dime. Imagine that. But in those days, he would come and negotiate a price with me. Because see, now I'm going to have to hire a chef to replace my daughter, who you're going to marry, and you're going to take her away. So when they finally agreed on the price, the bride and groom drank a glass of wine together to make the engagement official. Notice some parallels. Jesus at the Last Supper, when they took communion, he says, I will not drink this cup again until you see me in my kingdom. He being the groom, the church, the start of the church was in that upper room with him. They would be the apostles that upon this rock of revelation I'll build my church. And he, spiritually speaking, does the same thing with them. Now, they would not see each other for almost a year. The groom would return back to his daddy's house, and he would begin constructing a lean-to. I'm just using our language. A lean-to off the side of the father's home. And when it's ready, then it's time to go get my bride. But it would be an indefinite time period, usually up to a year, to be able to construct it and get it ready. But the key thing is this. Only the father knew. Only the father knew when it was time, when he had completed the lean-to, when the construction project for a home for your new bride, when it's ready, only the father knew when it was ready for him to go get his bride. When he approved of the place his son had prepared. What did Jesus say in John 14:2? Behold, I go and prepare a place for you. Only the Father knows when Jesus is coming back, because it's mirrored right here. Jesus, go and get your bride? I'm convinced even Jesus doesn't know when the rapture takes place. The Father will let him know. It's time. Go get your bride. When that happened, or during that time, they were essentially married. And again, it would require writ of divorce if they were unfaithful. So this was a chance to prove their faithfulness. So there were people in that day during this year, they were engaged, they were betrothed, but it was not uncommon for one or the other to be unfaithful. And they have to get a divorce even before they got married. So now you understand why Joseph reacts like he does initially when he discovers Mary's pregnant. Initially, he wanted to give her a writ of divorce because that's what everybody else did. And then what? He gets that dream. Now, this process of preparing a place for Mary off Daddy's house, this year-long process of her getting the bride would be preparing her dress and preparing her veil. And being ready that in a moment's notice, at any given night, she could jump into that gown, put that veil on, and be ready to go. But of course, it got interrupted by her getting pregnant. So, as we wrap it up in the next 3 or 4 minutes here, the bride would be getting herself ready. She would be making a dress, she'd be getting the veil, she would even select her bridal party. You see it in Matthew 25 with the parable of the 10 virgins. You see it in Revelation 19, which we'll get to in just a moment. When that day came and the father said to his son, okay, the place you have prepared is good. Now go get your bride. They would come at night when everyone else was asleep. It says the groomsmen, the bridegroom and the groomsmen, they would wake the neighborhood up playing the shofar. They would go through the streets, they'd wake up the whole house, they'd wake up the neighborhood, playing the shofar and having a big celebration. The moment the bride awoke up hearing that, she would immediately jump up, put her dress on, and put her veil on and cover it so she couldn't be seen by him. He would go and he would snatch her away, even if it required climbing a ladder to the 2nd story and getting her. He didn't knock on the door and ask the father's permission. He didn't have to because he had already paid the price. She's mine. I can come get her at any time I want to. And he did. They would return to the house and they'd put a canopy over the house. At that moment, she would remove the veil where he would see her for the first time as his bride, that is, and they would consummate the wedding. And that is what makes the two become one flesh. Because remember, Paul talked about it. Don't give yourself to a harlot. Because saying I do, standing right here, before you walk down the aisle saying, we now pronounce you husband and wife, that doesn't consummate the marriage. The sexual intercourse consummates the marriage. And that's what happened here. But what happened after that? Outside is the best man. The whole time they're inside on their honeymoon, so to speak. The best man in particular, and maybe even part of the bridal party, is outside. But particularly the best man. The groom would take to the best man the sheet with her blood on it as evidence of her virginity and hand it to the best man. He would take it back to the bridal party and they would celebrate for 7 days. Parallel that with the tribulation, 7-year tribulation. The bride and groom would stay inside for a 7-day honeymoon. And after that, he would present her as his bride. Does that not parallel the end times with the tribulation? Revelation 19 verses 7 through 8. Let us rejoice and be glad and give the glory to him. For the marriage supper of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Joseph was up and coming in society. God was not about to hand the Son of God over to either a woman or a man who could not handle unrighteous mammon and therefore could not handle true riches. Mary, you say, what was her role in it? She stewarded the word. And you're going to see next week how well she stewarded the word. She's able to quickly respond to Gabriel and say, be it done unto me according to thy word. And that is a story about Jesus' heroic parents. They weren't drawn out of a lottery. They had proved themselves to catch God's eye, his eye of favor. And he says, that's the one. That's why Gabriel says to Mary, you have found favor with God. That's the one. That's the young man I want to be the stepdad for the Son of God. There's a lot to the rest of the Christmas story, and more next week. Amen.